Now we're standing here in front of a Lockheed 12A, which is a early, fairly well streamlined transport aircraft that pioneered a lot of the air routes across Canada from east to west. You'll notice several things about this aircraft that you didn't see on some of the others. For one, you'll see a little pipe here, and there's a similar one on that side. And you might wonder what that does.
I did.
And that is part of the alcohol slinger arrangement, so that alcohol pumped out from a pump in the back of the engine comes out into a trough behind the propeller here, and then by centrifugal force, while the propeller is whirling around, the alcohol comes out and runs down the leading edge of the blade and prevents the formation of ice in an icing situation.
There's so many things about this aircraft. It's fun. In the first place, it's a beautiful aircraft.
Yeah, it's nicely built.
Not because it's polished, but the symmetrical shape of the whole thing.
Yeah.
But what puzzles me, there's several things that's puzzling me. First of all, why were they so stingy with those little glass panels for the pilot to look out of?
Well, they were, the smaller the piece of glass, the less likely it was to break. That was part of it. And forward visibility is a sort of a mixed blessing. Part of the time you're flying, you're probably flying on instruments. You don't need to see out. The only time you need to see out really clearly is to avoid other aircraft in the air. And at the days when this one flew, there weren't that many. The other thing is, you need to be able to see clearly for landing and takeoff, but you don't need to see very far up or down to do that. You're looking basically straight ahead. So they didn't go in for large windscreens. On fighter aircraft, of course, where you had to look in all directions, you had a great big greenhouse like we saw on the Harvard there a while ago. But for commercial aircraft, they tended to be rather small at that time. They've gotten bigger since, but that's another story.
Now, two engines, and they're both...
They're very similar to the engines that we were looking at on the Harvard just now. In fact, I think it's almost an identical engine. It has the same variable pitch propeller mechanism, but it has the addition of this de-icing equipment. You didn't need that on a training aircraft. You didn't send your students out to train in icing situations. They learned about that later, the hard way. But it wasn't the kind of thing you would risk a training aircraft in, because icing is very, very tricky and can be very destructive.
I know.
One of the problems, one of the reasons they went into this alcohol slinger bit was that centrifugal force would throw off ice off the propeller, but often in big chunks. And that could go right through the fuselage.
Oh.
And on this aircraft, that was part of the baggage compartment, so you might get the baggage damaged and other things. But if you didn't want it to come off in big chunks, you ran alcohol continuously, and it came off as slush. And this was much less damaging to the airplane. And you say, well, what about the rest of the airplane with icing? And the answer is, if you look at the leading edge of the wing, you had a de-icing unit here.
This is rubber.
Which was a rubber cover over the leading edge, and inside that were tubes. And you could pump compressed air through these and inflate them alternately so that you changed the whole shape of the leading edge. You could have the center bulge out, or you could have it bulge out down here. And after the ice had formed a certain thickness, you could bulge it a little bit and crack it, and then it would be carried away in the slipstream. You had to be careful about this. If you turned it on too soon, the ice might form out beyond where you could move it, and then it wouldn't crack. So you had to wait till the ice got a quarter of an inch thick or so, or maybe half an inch, and then you could crack it off in pieces.
It's incredible.
And that was the early method of dealing with icing situations.
They had a lot. They added so many things. For instance, now I thought this was a radar blister, but you've informed me it's not. Now tell me what this is.
Well, this was a streamlined housing for a loop which was connected to the antenna system of one of the radios on board. And by rotating the loop inside that housing, you could get a fix on the direction of a station that you were listening to. You could use it for finding your location by fixing the direction to a broadcast radio station. It didn't have to be a special station for aviation purposes. And if you took two fixes at different angles and had a chart, you knew where the two stations were, say for instance Calgary and Lethbridge or something like this, you could, by drawing lines at the proper angle on your chart, figure out where you were at any given time and how fast you were covering the course you were on. That item that you've got in your hand there, of course, is the pickup for the airspeed. One of them. Normally there would be two.
Yes.
Because one of the problems with these things, of course, was that they iced up too, and then you got wrong indications of airspeed.
What's the reason for these?
Those were communication aerials, I think,
Were they?
for communicating with the Department of Transport radio ranges or with the company's own bases. And there's another one farther back, if you notice, that runs farther back
yes,
again.
yes.
They carried a fair amount of radio equipment.
Yeah.
You notice here, this was when you were on the ground, in order not to run your battery down, you could connect a battery's power source there to keep your lights on and your various facilities running, and even to help you start, so you didn't run your batteries down. You had electric starters by then, but that was where you plugged in the ground power.
You give a lot of thought to.
Well, you know, this was in the. This was before this aircraft was used to check out the routes over which Air Canada, or as it was known in those days, Trans-Canada Airlines, was going to begin flying in the middle 30s. And the routes had to be laid out, the navigation equipment had to be put in, the communication equipment, the passenger facilities, and all the rest of it, all across the country, before you could actually operate an airline. And the Department of Transport built the facilities, laid them on, and this was one of the aircraft they used to check the facilities to make sure everything was in readiness for the great day when Trans-Canada Airlines started to fly passengers.
So really, for the information of everybody who watches this film, this was a workhorse, an experimental aircraft.
Yeah, it was a workhorse aircraft in pioneering what became one of the longer transcontinental air routes.
Yes, a couple of things here I want you to tell me about. These two with little, would that take off the nose cone? Or
I think those were the latches for opening the nose cone, and I don't know what they carried in there exactly. On this aircraft, they may have carried special navigation equipment. Yeah, they didn't have radar. Later on, you'd have radar in that position, but in those days, those were just the latches to open it.
And these two little protrusions here?
I don't know. Maybe they had some.
I've got a feeling that's electrical.
Yeah, I expect those may have been some other kinds of antennae. And you notice too here, you can see very clearly you've got retractable undercarriage. It retracts back into the back of the engine cowling. And this line down out here, of course, is the brake line. So you've got hydraulic brakes now, so you've got nice control on the ground, both for steering and stopping.
Smooth tires?
Smooth tires.
Smooth tires?
Yeah.
Again, they're probably landing on ice, so it wouldn't matter.
Well, paved runways and hopefully clean.
Yeah.
And they didn't really put much tread on tires because a landing, of course, spun the wheels from stop and tended to take the tread off pretty quick anyway.
Yeah. Now, there's one point I want to make here, Victor. This aircraft is totally opposite to the last aircraft we looked at, which was the Harvard. No matter where you look on this aircraft, you don't find one piece of painting
That's right.
of instruction.
Yeah, I think that's pretty largely true. There may be some emergency stuff down toward the back, but that's true over most of it. They left the paint off on a lot of passenger aircraft at the time of this one, partly because they didn't know how to paint a smooth enough finish to match the slipperiness, if you will, of a shiny metal finish. And so, in theory at least, the shiny metal was a little bit faster, used a little bit less fuel to go through the sky.
Yes.
And in an airline,
in
an airline, this was part of the operating cost, how much it cost you to move passengers from A to B. And so, in fact, they not only kept them clean and shiny, they even waxed them in the early days. And then eventually they realized that the rivet heads sticking out were the main drag, and they eventually figured out how to do flush riveting and speeded up quite a bit by that.
One big important question now would be important to the people who flew in it. How many people would you carry in this?
This one was set up, I think, with 12 passenger seats.
This is a totally different angle to the other plane, the other side of the plane. From the front, it looks beautiful. From this side, it's more than impressive. Victor, we were talking about seating. Now we've had a look inside, and we find that there are actually seats in there, isn't there?
Yeah. Well, they probably carried a crew in order to be able to carry out the testing that they were doing. They were checking the navigation equipment as much as anything. The radio, the ability of the aircraft radio to reach the ground stations and to receive messages from them, because as you know, there are magnetic anomalies in different parts of the country, and some places radio communication is good and some places it's not, and they needed to know that in advance. So they carried a lot of specialized radio equipment. You can see there's another loop on top in addition to the one underneath. There's a shorter wave, higher frequency radio facility up in the front, and so on. And the windows, of course, would give them a little daylight so they could see what they were doing, as well as having reading lights. In the passenger mode, the aircraft would have probably had a window for each seat. And I think the original configuration, when they started to use this type of aircraft for airline use, was either for 10 or 12 passengers, in which case you'd have had 5 windows on each side or 6. And the door, the passenger door, would have been on the far side of the aircraft. And there would have been a small galley inside the door and a jump seat for the stewardess. They had stewardesses right from the very beginning.
They did?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, in the beginning, the stewardesses had to have had nursing training so that if anyone became ill in flight, they had a trained person there to deal with.
So what you're actually saying is that this was the forerunner of the fleet that was put into action to carry the people away through far north and all that kind of thing.
Well, mainly east and west across Canada.
Oh, east and west.
Yeah.
Yes.
The east-west route was the first really well-organized route. The north-south routes sort of topsy and had been in place for a long time before this. But now we were talking about a scheduled route with flights that ran at fixed times, like trains, only faster.
But I was, my thoughts were that, were they all built like this, or were there variations in the way it was made?
You remember we saw a Fairchild 82 the
Yes,
other day on
yes.
skis. That was the typical northern type aircraft. Have properly prepared airports. So you landed on snow surfaces in the wintertime and generally on water in the summertime, and so you switched the airplane over onto floats. Now we're talking about working off prepared airports with passenger facilities, baggage handling facilities, and all the things we come to associate with airports. We're talking about the first passenger airports in Canada, and they were built as a chain right across from Montreal to the west coast at relatively short intervals because the aircraft had limited range.
How many years span is there between when this went into operation and today?
Well, these went into operation in the late 1930s.
Late 30s?
Yeah.
So we're looking at 50.
Well, you're looking at 50 years in round figures, yes.
But when we go back to the silver dart,
yeah, well, you're looking at
in 1909,
yeah, you're looking at nearly 80 years.
80 years, but what an evolution of
That's right.
changes.
Well, there were tremendous changes from the Silver Dart up to where we are here, and there were equally tremendous changes from what we've got here in front of us up to the present day with modern jet aircraft. You know, we moved from a speed of 35 miles an hour with the Silver Dart up to a speed of a couple of 100 miles an hour with this aircraft, and then the next big jump in the late 50s was from a few 100 miles an hour up to 550, 600 miles an hour with jets. And of course, if you want to go the full jump to the Concorde at twice that speed.
Would you, if you had a choice, even now, you know, hindsight, you wouldn't, don't think I would have any qualms about jumping into this?
Oh no, these airplanes were well built, they were tough, they had very well experienced crews, they had accidents, as there were very few people injured in flying in these aircraft. They were almost as dependable, given the technology, as our modern aircraft. Oh no, I would have no qualms at all about flying across Canada in one of these. In fact, you'd see a lot more scenery than you do nowadays, because these didn't fly very high. As you recall from your military service, when you went above 10 or 12,000 feet, you went on oxygen. And for passenger comfort, there was emergency oxygen available, but normally you didn't put the passengers on oxygen, so you didn't go much above 12,000 feet. And you get a much better look at the Rockies from 12,000 feet than you do from 38,000.
A bit scary though, that way.
Well, that's right. You have to know where the passes are.
Anyway,
You'll notice this aircraft has de-icing equipment on the tailplane, the same as it had on the main thing. And that was particularly important because if you got ice building up back here, you put a weight on the tail of the aircraft. And this made the aircraft tend to climb. And you could get into a completely uncontrolled condition if you couldn't control the icing back here. They worried much more about tail icing than they did about icing on the main plane. Partly because it was harder to control the aircraft if you carried a load of ice there. That was why they went to the trouble of putting this inflatable de-icer on the rear as well.
so it wouldn't really matter if your vertical fins were ice right up.
That wasn't nearly as important. It was the lift of the tailplane that was important in keeping the aircraft in level flight.
Well, I think we've covered this whole aircraft now, and in a word, it's magnificent. I wouldn't be afraid to fly in this for anybody.
No.
Let's move on to the next aircraft.
Okay.
Along with hundreds of recorded interviews, our group has been involved with the recovery of submerged aircraft from Norway, Belgium, Malta, England, and the Baltic Sea. Our Zoom show, airplanehunters.org, details these aircraft recoveries as we honor our veterans.
Hi everybody, Carl Casgard reporting to you from Bomber Command Museum of Canada in Nanton, Alberta, and along with my colleague and buddy Scott Knox at the Rebuild Shop in Arnprior, Ontario, where we're doing all the Halifax bomber restoration. Welcome. We want to give you an update, and we're going to try the split screen today, show you this little program on our great progress. We're in the last month of 2021 in December, and we've made good, steady progress.